It was a small town built around a cannery, tucked under the rolling mountains and bordering the bay, where its residents ventured into the surrounding woods to hunt. Portlock, Alaska, also known as Port Chatham, is now a still ghost town, with only graffitied, decrepit buildings left. Now, old abandoned towns aren't much to get excited about. Yeah, they're cool to walk through for a few minutes, but they tend to slide into the realm of nothing, becoming a forgotten dot on the map. Yet, this town often attracts hunters of a most unusual game. You see, these hunters are looking for a Bigfoot. A Bigfoot responsible for the dismemberment and deaths of several unfortunate hunters, miners, and loggers. So, watchers and listeners, let us gather once again to explore a strange history and the conspiracies around it as we hunt for the Nantinnuk. To understand the history behind this mystery, we need to look at the history of the native people in and around the Kenai Peninsula. The Alutiiq people are one of 8 native peoples in Alaska, with their traditional homelands in the Prince William Sound, the Outer Kenai Peninsula, the Kodak Archipelago, and the Alaska Peninsula. They share cultural similarities to the Anangan of the Aleutian Chain and the Yupik of the Bering Sea coast. You may have heard them referred to Aleut, which is what the Russians called all native peoples living in the southwest region of Alaska, and it is often the name some refer to when speaking of the indigenous people of the Aleutian Islands, though the word Anangan, we the people in the region, is reportedly gaining popularity. But Shukpiok is the traditional self-designator by natives of the Prince William Sound, the Outer Kenai Peninsula, the Kodak Archipelago, and the Alaska Peninsula. It is most popular in the Kenai Peninsula and means real person. Alutiiq is the Shukpiok way of saying Aleut. It gained popularity in the 80s and is most popular in the Kodak. Archaeologists believe that the Shukpiok peoples settled in the region around 7,500 years ago and cultivated a fishing tradition of both small fish and large sea mammals like whales. A trade system was set up with the mainland roughly 4,000 years ago, and labyrinths became popular. I just thought that was a cool thing to put in there. And it wasn't until about 800 years ago that designated leaders began to emerge. Some speculate this was because of resources, labor, and warfare that needed to be designated, but who knows. And then, in the 1780s, the Russians came. And you can imagine how the rest of this goes. Indigenous folk began to get sick and die from diseases they had no immunity to, and starvation. And they were put in what I can only think are labor camps, because these camps were dedicated to sea otter hunting, salmon fishing, and whaling. In 1867, America bought Alaska and introduced modern fishing. Many Alutiiq ended up working in canneries and started moving into a Western market type of economy. And, to absolutely no one's surprise, the Alutiiq language began to be suppressed in schools where native children would be beaten for speaking their own language. And, of course, there were Indian boarding schools, which have a whole history of being awful. Portlock is named after Captain Nathaniel Portlock, a British naval captain who sought refuge in the area from a storm in 1786. A year later, the port became part of the British Royal Navy, and yet the Russians were there. Well, they were probably busy. I couldn't really find anything else on Portlock until the 1900s, but there are some rumors, whispers in the wind, that early settlers of the area were driven away by an evil spirit that came in the form of a Sasquatch-like creature. But in 1900, an American firm brought in a fleet of fishing boats and built a cannery, and the community that formed around the cannery became known as Portlock, or Port Chatham, whichever one you prefer. It seemed that this creature made its eerie return, as in 1905, all the native workers in the cannery evacuated the area, deciding that there was something in the woods. They returned a year later, and the things that happened after this is where things get spooky. During the Roaring Twenties, it was said that a spirit of some kind haunted the nearby chromium mining camp. Reports of large footprints in the ground were seen, and trees were ripped out of the ground, turned upside down, and shoved back in the ground with the roots side up. Also, the post office was established during this time. Things didn't get deadly until the 1930s. Andrew Kenlock was a logger working in 1931. Apparently, he'd been gone a long enough time for people to go looking for him. What they found was gruesome. Kenlock was found not alive, with a nasty head wound, apparently hit on the head with a large piece of logging equipment that couldn't be handled by a mere man. And the way the scene was set up, it looked like something had picked him up and hit him in the head. There was also a case of a missing gold miner around this time. Later, a man named Tom Larson reported seeing a large, hairy creature on the beach where he'd gone to chop wood. He went to get his gun, and when he came back, he found he couldn't fire at the creature, only stare at it. The violence only worsened in the 1940s. A teacher who taught in Portlock at the time gave a tale of workers from the cannery who would go into the mountains and never return. There were tales of bodies being found, mutilated in ways that didn't resemble a bear or wolf attack. It was said that the number of bodies found totaled around 36, and they were found on trails, in rivers, and floating in the bay. Cannery workers refused to come back to work and had to be promised that armored guards would make rounds at the cannery. Moose hunters began to claim that they came across human-like tracks over 18 inches long. In 1949, fearing the monster and the horrors this Sasquatch was leaving behind, the residents of Portlock picked up and fled overnight. But the terror didn't stop there. In 1968, a goat hunter claimed to have been chased by a creature when hunting in the area. In 1973, 3 hunters reported that they heard something walking around their tent on what sounded like 2 feet while they were taking shelter from a storm. These stories continued and came to a head when Melania Helen Cale talked about Portlock's demise in an article for the Homer Tribune. Melania was an elder of Nalmalek, a Shukpiok town next to Port Graham, and had grown up in Portlock. She cited a creature called the Nuntanuk as the thing that terrorized the town to the point where the residents fled to the near Port Graham. As you can imagine, this idea that there was some kind of murder Sasquatch roaming a part of Alaska took off like a firestorm for some people. It even became the topic of a show called Alaskan Killer Bigfoot. Have I watched it yet? No, but I plan on it. Maybe I'll review it. Probably not. Anyway, enough Bigfoot hunters or ghost town explorers or whatever believe in this conspiracy enough to wander through the remains of Portlock that are slowly being taken over by the surrounding forest. The real question is, will they find the Nuntanuk or something much worse? Something that should have been left alone a long time ago. Probably not. In the podcast Skeptoid with Brian Dunning, the researcher dug around to find anything in newspapers about these murders. Surely something as horrible as mangled bodies being found along trails and in the bay would have been reported. Well, there aren't any reports of things like this happening. In fact, the biggest crime reported from Portlock was that the postmaster was arrested by the Prohibition Enforcement Bureau for having a gallon of moonshine. It was 1924, so that's not that surprising. There was a reported accidental death in 1920, but there was mining, logging, and fishing in the area. All dangerous. So that's not super strange. So the likelihood of all these bodies being found around the bay and that they were acts of a murderous Bigfoot is not that high. Ah, you say, but what about Melania Cale? She explicitly said that the reason why the townspeople fled Port Chatham was because of the Nuntanuk. Well, Sally Ash, a cousin of Melania, reported that Melania Cale had made up the story about the Nantinak killing people. While she does deny that's why the townspeople left, she doesn't deny the Nantinak's existence. According to her and other local legends, the Nantinak used to live among humans, but left to live in the woods. It likes to be alone, which is why Ash says that no one will ever be able to catch him. He's too fast for the human eye to see, and can change into different animals. And then there's all those stories from others who have claimed to see him, which we'll get into it. However, the reason for locals abandoning Portlock is a bit less supernatural. You see, around the end of the 40s, Alaska Highway Route 1 was built, and this allowed more efficient transportation between Anchorage and the towns along the peninsula. And those towns began to boom from the commerce it brought. That in turn made shipping an inefficient way to send things. So towns that weren't accessible by the highway died, which is what happened to Portlock. In terms of all these stories about the Nantinak, it could be that this was used as a way to caution kids. Don't go out into the woods or the Nantinak will get you. Don't stray too far from home or you'll be visited by the Nantinak. A scary monster roaming a secluded area could have been enough to keep kids close and from wandering away. But what about Port Chatham now? Well, now the town is owned by the Chugach Corporation, a community-owned Alaska Native corporation. Though there's not much left of Port Chatham, but the people who called it home keep the memory of it and the feelings of connection close to them. There is a warning, though. A warning not to go there and bother the memories of that place. And a warning not to hunt for the creature that stalks its borders. As Sally Ash cautioned, leave Nantinak alone. And guys, listen. If an indigenous person of wherever you find yourself in this world says to you, hey, don't go there, don't mess with that, don't go there, don't mess with that. So, whether Nantinak is real or not, let's just all agree to leave Port Chatham alone. Well, that's all the time I have for today. Thanks for coming to Histories, Mysteries, and Conspiracies. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe on whatever social media platform this is being aired on. There are so many more programmers that belong to the Central Arkansas Library System that have a lot of cool stuff out there. So don't miss out on it. Guys, we'll see you later.